For leaves of arugula, 1 cherry tomato, sliced in half like it had done something wrong. That was the bride's dinner. At her own wedding, while every other plate at the head table carried seared salmon, roasted potatoes, and a little tower of asparagus tied in chive. Nobody said a word. Not the bridesmaid whose fork froze midair. Not the best man who suddenly found his water glass fascinating. The only person who didn't flinch was the woman who'd ordered it, the groom's mother, smiling at the next table over like she'd just done something generous. She had no idea her son was about to stand up, walk the length of the room, and stop everyone's fork at once. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's back up. Not just to the start of the night, but to 6 months earlier, to the first dinner where Diane made her opinion of Mara clear without ever saying it out loud. 6 months before the wedding, Diane hosted an engagement dinner at her house, cloth napkins, place cards, a seating arrangement she'd clearly spent more time on than the actual menu. Mara arrived early with a bottle of wine Theo had picked out, nervous in the specific way you're nervous when you already suspect someone has decided not to like you. Diane greeted her at the door with a hug that lasted exactly as long as etiquette required and not 1 second longer. "You look lovely," she said, eyes moving down and back up in a way that made the compliment feel like an inspection. "We're doing a lighter menu tonight. I hope that's all right." It wasn't a question either. Mara would learn, over the following months, that very few things Diane phrased as questions were actually questions. Dinner that night was a beautifully plated portion of grilled chicken and steamed vegetables. Smaller than everyone else's, seasoned less, served with a small smile and the phrase "just trying to be considerate" attached to it like a bow.
Theo Hunter noted.
Theo rarely noticed the things his mother did quietly, because Diane had spent 30 years making sure her quiet things stayed quiet. Mara noticed. She said nothing, ate what was in front of her, and complimented the wine on the way out. She'd been managing rooms like this one since she was a teenager, smiling through comments about her body dressed up as concern, thanking people for opinions she never asked for, making everyone else comfortable at the cost of her own appetite, literal and otherwise. What Diane didn't know that night, and wouldn't know for another 6 months, was that the woman she'd just served a smaller plate to had, 3 years earlier, personally kept the very venue Diane had chosen for the wedding from losing its biggest annual fundraiser. Diane had picked that ballroom specifically because it photographed well and impressed her friends. She had no idea she'd also picked a room her future daughter-in-law had quietly saved from disappearing. Some stories take a while to catch up to the people living inside them. This one was about to catch up fast. 640 guests had RSVP'd yes to Mara and Theo's wedding, though only 200 made the final seating chart. Diane, the groom's mother, had fought for a specific arrangement of that chart for weeks. Who sat near the windows, who sat near the band, who sat close enough to the head table to be photographed in the background of the toast. Mara didn't fight her on any of it. She'd learned, over 18 months of engagement, that picking her battles with Diane meant picking almost none of them. Ivory lace, hair pinned loose at the temples. She walked into her own reception glowing with the kind of light that only shows up once, on exactly this day, and she intended to enjoy every second of it. For 3 seconds longer, she still did. "Just a small plate for her, dear. We don't want her uncomfortable later." Diane said it to the caterer, not to Mara, though Mara stood close enough to catch every syllable. The voice had the practiced warmth of a woman who'd never once raised it in public and never needed to. Warmth was Diane's weapon. She'd been sharpening it for 30 years. The tray came out on schedule. Salmon for the table, potatoes for the table, asparagus tied in chive for the table. For Mara. For leaves of arugula, 1 tomato, cut in half. A bridesmaid's fork paused in the air and didn't move for a full 3 seconds. Nobody at that table said anything out loud. The silence itself said plenty. Mara looked down at the plate and did the thing she trained herself to do since she was 14 years old. She smiled like it was fine, picked up her fork, and ate the arugula 1 leaf at a time so no one would have to watch her sit there with an empty plate. She'd spent a lifetime making other people comfortable with her body. Tonight, apparently, was no exception. Even in a dress she'd cried happy tears trying on. What none of the guests at that table knew, what Diane herself didn't know, was that the venue standing around them, the ballroom, the staff, the entire glittering machine of the evening, existed partly because of money Mara had quietly funneled into it 3 years earlier with a single condition. Nobody was ever supposed to find out. Mara had chosen that condition on purpose. Growing up, she'd watched her own mother turn every act of generosity into a story told at dinner parties for years afterward. The time we helped the neighbors, the time we covered someone's tuition, until the giving started to feel less like kindness and more like currency spent on other people's admiration. Mara had promised herself early on that if she was ever in a position to help anyone quietly, She'd keep it quiet, all the way through, no exceptions. She'd kept that promise for 3 years without a single slip, which was exactly why nobody in this ballroom, not the board members, not the bridesmaids, not her own new mother-in-law, had the faintest idea what she'd built underneath the room they were all sitting in. That detail would matter a great deal in about 40 minutes. 20 minutes passed before the second course landed, and the pattern repeated itself with the kind of precision that told you it wasn't an accident. Diane called it portion thoughtfulness out loud, at volume, to the table across from her. The one seated with 3 members of the venue's board, the one she'd specifically requested be placed within eye line of the head table. That detail mattered too. Diane hadn't shrunk the plate to protect Mara from anything. She'd shrunk it as a performance, staged for an audience she actually cared about impressing. Mara's second plate arrived exactly the way the first one had. Smaller, quieter, cut down without ever being announced as a rule. Not empty, just smaller in a way that made explaining it feel more humiliating than the plate itself. A different bridesmaid leaned toward the bride's ear. "Do you want me to say something?" "No," Mara whispered back. "Don't make it a thing at my own wedding." That instinct, protect the room, absorb the discomfort so nobody else has to carry it, was the exact instinct that had made Mara, for 3 years running, the reason a struggling venue kept its lights on, a sick chef's wife got paid help, and a server with visa trouble didn't lose her apartment. Nobody in that ballroom knew any of that. Nobody was supposed to. Across the room, the groom refilled his father's water glass, laughing at something one of the ushers said, entirely unaware that 2 courses had already come and gone without his wife eating a normal meal at her own reception. That was about to change. Dessert should have been the easy course. Cake, coffee, the kind of dish nobody argues over. Diane intercepted the server near the kitchen door before it ever reached the table. "Skip her," she said, quiet enough that only the server could hear. "She'll thank me later." The server hesitated, tray balanced on one palm, eyes flicking toward the head table and back. Diane did not hesitate. She'd made a career out of never hesitating in front of people who could be talked out of asking questions. What Diane hadn't accounted for was the kitchen runner 3 feet behind her. A 22-year-old temp holding her phone in one hand and a photo of the handwritten plating card taped to a clipboard in the other. "Bride half portions only." Diash. The runner wasn't trying to start anything. She was just trying to figure out who was supposed to see it, because something about the instruction felt wrong in a way she couldn't quite name and didn't want to be blamed for later. She showed it to the first person she recognized walking past. That person happened to be the groom. Theo looked at the photo for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked up, scanned the head table, and found the plate in front of his wife. 4 leaves of arugula on the first course, a smaller portion on the second, nothing at all coming on the third. Something in him went very still. Not loud, not dramatic, the kind of still that happens right before a room changes shape. He set the water pitcher down on the nearest table without excusing himself. He walked back through the reception at a pace slow enough to look controlled and fast enough that 3 separate conversations stopped mid-sentence as he passed. He stopped behind his mother's chair. "Where's my wife's plate?" Not a question. A demand dressed up as a question out of 30 years of politeness he was about to abandon. Diane turned in her seat with the smile she used whenever she believed a room could still be redirected. "She's fine, Theo. I was just being thoughtful." Thoughtful for whom? Diane blinked. It was the first time in longer than Theo could remember that his mother hadn't had a follow-up sentence ready. "You didn't shrink her plate for her," he said, loud enough now that the tables nearest them had gone fully silent. "You shrank it for the room. For them." He didn't point at the board table. He didn't need to. Every head at that end of the room had already turned. "My wife will eat what everyone else at this wedding is eating, or nobody eats until she does." He pulled out the chair beside Mara himself. He didn't sit back down at his own place and wait for things to resolve quietly. He sat next to her in front of 200 guests and didn't touch his own plate again until hers arrived. Full, matching, unedited, exactly like everyone else's. Mara's hands were steady on the tablecloth, but her jaw wasn't. She'd spent the entire night rehearsing how to make herself smaller so nobody else would have to feel anything uncomfortable. She hadn't rehearsed for someone refusing to let her. A waiter appeared within 90 seconds carrying a full plate, salmon, potatoes, asparagus, no substitutions. Word moves fast in a kitchen when the groom has just made a scene at the head table. Diane sat frozen for exactly as long as it took the room to remember how to breathe again. Then, from the staff table near the kitchen, a chair scraped back. He'd worked that venue for 11 years. He wasn't family. He wasn't wedding party. He had no professional reason to insert himself into a family argument at someone else's reception, which was exactly why the room went quiet in a different way when he stood up. "I want to say something if the bride will allow it." Mara nodded. She was too stunned to do much else. 3 years ago, this venue nearly lost the funding for its winter charity gala. A donor pulled out 2 weeks before the event, and we were going to have to cancel a program that a lot of families depend on every December. He paused, letting that sit. Mara covered the shortfall herself. She asked us never to put her name on the program. I only know because I was the one who processed the check. A few guests exchanged glances. Diane's face had gone very still. Last spring, our head chef's wife got sick. Serious sick. The kind where you either take time off to be with your family or you keep working because you can't afford not to. Somebody arranged 2 months of covered shifts through the events office so he wouldn't have to choose. Anonymous, they said. I found out who a few weeks later by accident. He looked directly at Mara now, not at the room. And this past winter, one of our servers had her visa paperwork held up. Weeks without pay, rent due regardless. Somebody found her 3 separate temp catering jobs in 11 days so she wouldn't fall behind. He paused, and for the first time in 11 years on this floor, his voice caught slightly. That server was my daughter. I never told the bride I knew who'd helped her. I didn't think she wanted it known, so I never asked her about it directly. I just watched and I put it together, and I decided that if I ever got the chance to say it out loud, I would. A woman at the board table put a hand over her mouth. Someone near the back of the room actually set down their fork. I don't know what tonight's plates were about. He let the silence stretch just long enough to matter. But I know exactly who your son married. He sat back down. Nobody clapped exactly, it wasn't that kind of moment. But the quiet that followed had a different texture than the quiet from 20 minutes earlier. That silence had been embarrassment. This one was recalibration. Diane's face did something complicated. Not an apology. Not yet. But the first visible crack in a performance she'd been running since before Theo was born. Whatever she'd built her evening around, it hadn't accounted for the maitre d' having a memory, or the receipts to back it up. The band picked the moment to start playing again, which gave the room permission to look away from Diane and back toward each other, the way rooms do when they need an exit from a feeling too big to sit inside. Mara excused herself to the hallway outside the reception hall, where the lighting was dimmer and the noise dropped to a hum. She found the ladies' room mirror and stood in front of it, reapplying lipstick with hands that weren't quite steady, not from sadness exactly. From the strange vertigo of having been defended out loud, in public, after years of doing the defending herself and calling it fine. Theo found her there 2 minutes later. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "The plate thing. I didn't do it for you." He leaned against the doorframe, hands in his pockets, in no hurry. "I did it because I married someone I actually see. Everything after that is just math." She laughed despite herself, a short, surprised sound. "That's a very engineer thing to say at your own wedding. You married an engineer." He reached over and tucked a loose piece of hair back from her face, the same gesture he'd used on their third date, in a much less complicated hallway. "You belong at the center of this table. In every course, in every room, for the rest of it. That's not negotiable, and it was never supposed to be a debate tonight. She's going to make the next 6 holidays miserable. Maybe." He shrugged, unbothered in a way that only comes from having already decided something a long time ago. She can be miserable at a full table or a happy one. I'd rather she figure out which one she wants to be invited back to. Mara set the lipstick down and looked at herself in the mirror for a second longer than usual. Not checking her makeup, just checking whether the woman looking back at her recognized this version of the night. She did. "Can I ask you something?" she said, still watching her own reflection instead of him. "Anything. Did you know? About the venue, the chef's wife, all of it?" Theo shook his head slowly. "Not until tonight. You never told me. I didn't want it to be a thing." She turned to face him now. "That's kind of the whole problem, isn't it? I spent 3 years making sure nobody had to feel indebted to me, and today your mother tried to make me feel like I didn't deserve a full plate at my own wedding." She was wrong about the plate. Theo took her hands, his thumbs moving slowly over her knuckles. "She's been wrong about a lot of things where you're concerned, for longer than tonight. I let it slide more than I should have because it was easier than the fight. That's on me, not just her. So what happens now? Now we go back in there, we eat the cake, and every single person in that room remembers exactly how the night went, for the rest of their lives, if the toasts are any good." He smiled, the first easy smile since the plates had started. "And starting tomorrow, my mother learns what it means to earn a seat at our table instead of assuming she already has one. Mara laughed, finally, the real kind. That's very dramatic for someone who just said everything is math. It's math with consequences. Different thing. Weddings get remembered in fragments. Guests forget the flowers within a week and forget the band's second set entirely. But they remember the moments where something true got said out loud in a room built for pleasantries. By the time the cake was cut, 3 different guests had quietly found Mara to tell her some version of the same thing, that they'd noticed the plates, that they hadn't known what to say, that they were glad someone finally did. The bridesmaid whose fork had frozen midair during the first course found Mara near the gift table. "I should have said something the second it happened," she said. "I'm sorry I didn't." "You didn't cut the portions," Mara told her. "You don't owe me an apology for freezing. I froze plenty of times myself before tonight." The best man, still slightly sheepish about his fascination with his water glass, made a point of toasting Mara directly during his speech later that night. Not Theo, not the couple generically, but Mara by name, calling her the reason this family got a decent wake-up call it needed for a long time, which got a laugh, and then, from a few tables, something closer to applause than a laugh usually earns. One of the board members from the table Diane had been performing for made a point of shaking Theo's hand on the way out and saying nothing about plates at all, which was its own kind of message. Another approached Mara directly, introduced herself properly for the first time despite having sat 2 tables away for the better part of 2 hours, and said only, "The gala wouldn't exist without you. I've known that for 3 years. Thank you for finally letting the room know it too." Mara didn't quite know what to say to that, so she said thank you, and meant it more than the words usually carry. Diane spent the rest of the night at the edges of conversations rather than the center of them, which for a woman who'd spent 30 years engineering her way to the center of every room, was its own quiet consequence. Nobody confronted her again. Nobody needed to. The maitre d's speech had done the confronting for the whole room, and Diane understood the math of it well enough not to test the room's patience twice in one evening. She left before the last dance, citing a headache. Nobody believed the headache, and nobody said so. Spring came, and with it, the venue's annual charity gala, the same one Mara had quietly kept afloat 3 years earlier, the one the maitre d' had described to a silent ballroom in front of 200 wedding guests. Diane arrived early. She found the event's coordinator at the seating chart table, going over table assignments with a clipboard nearly identical to the one that had caused all the trouble in the first place. "Put her at the head table," Diane said, tapping a name on the chart. "Full place setting. No substitutions." The coordinator glanced up, unsure whether this required an explanation. Diane didn't offer one. It wasn't an apology. Diane didn't have the vocabulary for those, not yet, maybe not ever, but it was the closest thing to one she currently had access to, and everyone at that table understood the translation without needing it spelled out. Across the room, Mara watched the exchange from near the entrance, a glass of sparkling water in one hand, Theo's arm loosely around her waist. She didn't need to hear the words to understand what had shifted. Some corrections don't come with speeches. Some just come with a seating chart, quietly rewritten by the person who wrote the wrong one the first time. "I used to think being smaller made people comfortable," she thought, watching the coordinator nod and move the name card to the center of the table. "Now I think being fully seen was the only portion that was ever the right size." Theo caught her eye across the room and lifted his glass an inch, the smallest possible toast, meant for an audience of one. She lifted hers back. Diane crossed the room a few minutes later, coffee in hand, and stopped a careful arm's length from her daughter-in-law. Close enough to talk, far enough to still retreat if she needed to. "The chart looks good this year," Mara said, before Diane had to find an opening line of her own. "I had help remembering what mattered." Diane looked down at her coffee rather than at Mara. "I'm not going to pretend the wedding didn't happen. I'm also not going to stand here and perform an apology I haven't fully earned yet. But I'd like the chance to earn it. If you'll let me." It wasn't smooth. It wasn't the speech a better version of Diane might have delivered years earlier, before 30 years of certain habits had calcified into something harder to unlearn. But it was real in a way none of her carefully staged warmth at the wedding had been, and Mara recognized the difference immediately. "Start with the small things," Mara said. "Full portions. No performances for an audience. We'll build from there." Diane almost smiled. Not the practiced version, something rawer. "I can do that." Across the room, the head chef, the one whose wife had been quietly covered for 2 months the previous spring, caught Mara's eye and gave her the smallest possible nod, the kind 2 people share when they both know something the rest of the room hasn't caught up to yet. If your mother-in-law shrank your plate at your own wedding to impress a room full of people who didn't matter, would you forgive her the moment she finally set the table right? Or would some part of you always remember the exact size of that salad? Tell me in the comments what you would have done in Theo's seat, because in my inbox, half of you would have stood up sooner, and half of you would have waited for the receipts first.